Hello everyone and welcome back to Dragalia Foundry, a fan channel where everything Dragalia Lost can be found. In this video, I'll be talking all about how Wyrmprints work in version 2.0 of Dragalia Lost. In previous versions of the game, up to 2 Wyrmprints could be equipped directly to adventurers, and most Wyrmprints had 2 abilities. In version 2.0, instead, up to 5 Wyrmprints can be equipped to weapons, but generally speaking, each Wyrmprint has been reduced to only having a single ability. The cost to acquire Wyrmprints, upgrade their stats, and acquire extra copies are basically unchanged. Under this new system, up to 3 5-star prints and 2 lower rarity prints can be equipped to each weapon. However, the third 5-star print slot is usually locked behind a decent cost upgrade, one that takes some time, materials, and effort to grind up. I'd only really recommend going for this on the best weapons in your collection, namely the 6-star Agito weapons, or if you run out of other projects and just simply wish to max out all of your gear. So in practice, outside of an endgame weapon, it's more like 4 slots to work with, 2 5-stars and 2 lower rarity slots. This is very similar to what we had before, since 4 slots means 4 abilities under the new system, with the extra option to upgrade your weapons for that 5th and final slot with enough grinding. The big difference is that because each Wyrmprint now has only a single ability, the old tried and true combinations that were once optimal are not necessarily optimal anymore. A lot more Wyrmprints have become interchangeable with one ability, yet at the same time, the requirement to use lower rarity prints means many prints which never saw use before are now for the first time relevant and sometimes even excellent. We'll get into those shortly when we talk about general builds by elements and weapon type, but first, there is something else to discuss. An added wrinkle to Wyrmprints is the presence of a new Affinity Bonus system, which gives you extra bonus abilities for equipping Wyrmprints which share an affinity symbol. These abilities don't count toward the caps shown on Wyrmprints themselves, meaning they're really an extra effect on top of your Wyrmprint abilities. There are 11 different affinities in total, each of which have various bonus abilities depending on how many prints you have of that affinity equipped to the same weapon. The Crown's Boon affinity bonus, for instance, gives you plus 10% skill damage when you've equipped at least 4 prints with that affinity. Other affinity bonuses are shown on screen now and include things like Broken Punisher plus 10%, Strength plus 8%, Skill Haste up to 10%, Force Strike damage up to 15%, Dragon damage up to 30%, Burn, Stun, Paralysis, and Curse Res plus 100%, and finally, Buff Time up to plus 15%. The question with these effects is what cost you pay as far as equipping less desirable prints just for the sake of getting an affinity bonus. Certainly, stuff like the Affliction Resistance is something that wouldn't be considered worth it in Dragalia's past, but I do like how it lets us use our favorite units comfortably. The other effects, though, all could hypothetically be worth it, depending on how much you have to go out of your way to complete affinity sets. And as you can also see on screen, sometimes you still get a partial or full bonus even if you don't have a full set of 4 Wyrmprints with the same affinity. To make it easier to decide what to use at a glance, I've rounded up and grouped all current Wyrmprints by affinity. Note that not all prints have an affinity to begin with, so those without one can't help you obtain any kind of affinity bonus. That's not to say those prints are bad, of course, but having any affinity at all is pure upside for now. Let's start with the Crown's Boon affinity. This affinity takes 4 prints to achieve its skill damage plus 10% bonus. And remember, 2 or 3 print slots are for 5 stars and the others are for lower rarity prints. I would say this affinity bonus generally isn't worth it because using it means spending 2 5-star print slots on skill damage, which caps out at 40% from Wyrmprints, and the lower rarity prints aren't really special. Now let's talk Lance's Boon. This affinity scales from Force Strike damage plus 5% with 2 prints up to Force Strike damage plus 15% with 4 prints. And unlike Crown's Boon, this one probably is going to be worth it for some characters whose kits focus on using Force Strikes. The thing that makes this affinity great is it has more diversity among its print abilities. You can spin 2 5-star slots, getting Force Strike damage plus 50% and Flurry Strength plus 20%, and already get a Lance's Boon affinity bonus, especially reasonable if you have the 5th print slot unlocked. While it'll be rare to get the full bonus since the 3 to 4-star Lance Boon prints aren't as universally good, they're still decent in the right context. The Dragon's Boon affinity is next, and this one looks very strong to me for dragon-centric characters. With global rebalancing changes and an overall buff to dragons, I expect dragon strategies to improve considerably, and the plus 30% damage boost from this affinity bonus is nothing to sneeze at. Again, like with Lance's Boon, there's a nice diversity of effects here. It's pretty plausible to think a character focused on dragon ramping will want all of Dragon's Claws, Dragon's Skill, and possibly Dragon Damage or even Dragon Haste. Not to mention, there are supplemental effects like Last Devastation, Strength Double Buff, Flurry Devastation, and Slayer Strength available as well. This is one of the deepest affinities overall. The Axe's Boon affinity is next, and it grants Broken Punisher plus 10%, and this one doesn't seem to be very good. The pool of effects isn't very deep, and in particular, requiring 4 slots just to get the bonus isn't really worth it. There are the inklings of something here if more prints get added in the future, since several of these prints center around explosive or low HP damage, and that does go well with Broken Punisher, but for the time being, this affinity looks like an easy skip as far as trying to attain the bonus. The Sword's Boon affinity is another all-or-nothing bonus, this one for plus 8% strength. It sounds good, but again, the pool of available Wyrmprints is sparse. You can access buff skill time and striking haste at 5-star, but the other 5-star prints in this category just grant full HP equals strength. I can't see too many adventurers using this, although it is one to watch as the affinity pool expands. There are some good effects here, and the 4 stars that grant strength and skill damage are pretty solid, if better 5-star prints emerge to pair with them. The Bow's Boon affinity isn't all or nothing, and it looks okay even if its benefit of skill haste is mild. There are some welcome effects here for buff bots, but no direct buff time print. I think there's a decent chance buff bots choose to balance some amount of this affinity, maybe 3 slots, with 2 slots from the next affinity, which itself has access to a lot more buff time prints. Even then, it's a tight fit, due to the restriction that 2 to 3 prints must be 5 stars while the other 2 prints are of lower rarity. And for DPS units, I don't see this affinity being used much at all. The Staff's Boon affinity is our final non-affliction related affinity, and again, this one isn't all or nothing. You do get a small boost to buff time if you have even 2 prints from this affinity equipped, which scales up if you have 3 or 4. This boon seems best for healers who care both about buff time, often thanks to regen, and recovery, but I also wouldn't be too surprised if some buff bots just run Bellathorna and From Whence He Comes into 3 and 4 star slots for the added affinity bonus. The challenge as far as using this is there is no obvious 5-star you'd want here unless you're actually healing, so not many units would want the full bonus. The last several affinities all provide affliction resistance of 100% to burn, paralysis, stun, and curse, but none of these are particularly good. The affliction guard prints usually suffice with careful play, so it's seldom worth it to spend an extra print slot just to transform that into true resistance. But you never know, perhaps there are some setups that choose to run this for added safety or ease of auto battles. All in all, I think if any affinity bonuses stand a chance to actually warp your print choices, it's probably the Dragon's Boon and to a lesser extent Lance's Boon that will. The Bow and Staff boons could also see play for buff bots and healers especially, although it's not immediately obvious to me that it's worth going for these at the expense of element-specific buff time prints or other utility prints like Skill Prep and Healing Double Buff. Affinities aside, I think Wyrmprints will work in much the same way as before as far as what's optimal, varying by element, weapon type, and the content you're facing off against. As before, you're going to want to diversify the types of abilities you have to try deal the most damage possible. In general, putting all your eggs in one basket with Wyrmprints is not the best idea, especially since abilities have caps. I've seen many players confused by this, but like abilities do count toward the same cap even if they don't have the exact same name. For example, full HP equals strength and flurry strength don't stack beyond the overall strength cap of 20% strength from prints. The same is true for, let's say, regular skill damage and sword skill damage. The limit is 40% overall skill damage from prints, even if the names on the abilities are slightly different. So overall, a variety of effects tends to be key to success with prints. As a general principle, I think most DPS units will want the following 3 effects: skill damage, strength, and affliction punisher. Their remaining slots can then be used for auxiliary effects like critical rate, strength double buff, broken punisher, skill haste, skill prep, and so on, depending on what that particular character and what your overall team comp calls for. Most buff bots will probably want buff time, skill haste, and some combination of skill prep or force charge, with their other slots being flexible. And most healers will work similarly to buff bots, except that they might also value some amount of recovery too. Of course, characters focused on Dragon Transformation may disregard all of these rules since Dragon's Boon seems really great. With all that said, some players prefer to look at recommended builds and just go off of those, so I wanted to provide that for this video as well. Just like before this change, I think equipment largely comes down to the individual unit, so consider these guideposts for how to equip each element and weapon type rather than prescriptions. Let's start by going through each element, and within we'll talk about each weapon type. First, for the flame element, the biggest obstacle faced is that Burning Punisher only exists at the 5-star rarity right now. Instead of spending the 2 default 5-star slots on skill damage and strength, flame units must make a choice of whether they want Burning Punisher, at least until you unlock the 5-star print slot. This means flame, along with light, has a larger incentive to try to unlock the 5-star print slots early compared to shadow, water, and wind, because those elements get their Affliction Punisher prints via a 4-star slot. Until you unlock all 5 slots, flame units will likely want to run skill damage and Burning Punisher in their 5-star slots, and strength and critical rate in their 4-star slots. But once you unlock all 5, flame builds for DPS are pretty self-explanatory. Then you can get all 3 of skill damage, Affliction Punisher, and strength in the 5-star slots, and choose from among critical rate, strength double buff, or other abilities at 4-star. Each weapon type, except for blades and staves, has some best-in-slot prints for skill damage of 40%, and some, like axes, daggers, and bows, also have specific prints that offer a lot of critical rates. The best strength prints in general are things like Memory of a Friend and Flash of Genius, which allow you to achieve 20% flurry strength off of just 1 print slot. But for characters who can't maintain a combo, you can also use HP 70% equals 13% strength prints, or full HP equals 15% strength prints if those are easier for your particular setup. Having said that, within the flame elements, combo time is abundant thanks to some of the preferred backliners as well as its presence on Agito weapons. So in general, you're going to want to go with 40% skill damage plus 20% strength for your 5-star slots, with the third, once unlocked, containing Burning Punisher. This means that prints like the Shining Overlord, Summer Paladins, Twinfold Bonds, Candy Couriers, Dragon and Tamer, and Forest Bonds are staples in Flame as well as across all other elements. Flame buff bots and healers will vary much more based on their kits and the type of utility effects they want compared to DPS, but in general, since Flame has no exclusive buff time Wyrmprint, I could see Bellathorna plus From Whence He Comes being used alongside Bo's boon prints. For certain characters like Yukata Cassandra, I also think proper maintenance might come into play for buff time and to access the elusive Swords boon affinity. Other than that, the usual prints like Force Charge, Skill Prep, and Skill Haste all seem good. Next, for the wind element, we have the good fortune that Plaguebringer is a 4-star print, and I suspect Poison Punisher will still be a staple going into the new meta. This leaves room for 2 5-star prints to be 1 skill damage print and 1 strength print when it comes to DPS units, with a third unlockable 5-star slot being flexible. The other 4-star slot besides Plaguebringer will also vary with the character in question, but just like with Flame, critical rates, double buff effects, Broken Punisher, Overdrive Punisher, and so on are all reasonable choices. For wind healers and buff bots, Astounding Trick and Dog Stay are likely the most coveted 5-stars, with the 4-star slots open to defense, double buffs, recovery, resistance, skill haste, and other utility effects. In the water element, just like wind, the Affliction Punisher print, His Clever Brother, is a 4-star. So, I expect water will look much like wind in terms of general print setups. Skill damage and strength at 5-star, plus a flex slot once you unlock it, and His Clever Brother plus a flex slot at 4-star, so you make sure you're getting your Frostbite Punisher. Notable within water for the flex slot at 5-star is the Prince of Dragonyule as a nice source of critical rates for non-axe, non-bow units. Water buff bots and healers no longer have their own special buff time print, but there's still good sources of skill haste and united haste around, besides element neutral buff time. One setup I could see working out nicely thanks to affinity bonuses is something like Study Rabbits, Castle Cheer Core, Jewels of the Sun, Seaside Memory, and From Whence He Comes, since this gives access to both the bow and staff boons. Shadow has its own element-specific prints, Howling to the Heavens and Luck of the Draw for Flurry Devastation and buff time respectively, but otherwise it functions in exactly the same pattern we've outlined so far. For DPS units, this means Plaguebringer in 1 4-star slot, skill damage and strength in the 5-star slots, and a few flexible slots that will eventually get filled out with critical rates or other bonus effects. Double buff prints stand out thanks to Patia and Grace. For dedicated buff bots and healers, you'll likely still want buff time, healing double buffs, recovery, skill haste, and so on, although many Shadow units still pack a punch even if they're in support roles, so that is something to consider. And finally, when it comes to the light element, light is most like flame in that it wants Spirit of the Season but can only access it comfortably once you have that extra print slot available. Light has a few specialized prints, like one for 8% critical rate for units who can't maintain a combo, and one for buff time, but otherwise the same types of builds apply. I would say that dragon-centric builds are also worth exploring on all light units, thanks to the explosive potential of Thor and the light Agito weapon skill. It doesn't seem super likely, but there is a chance that dragon setups are much stronger than I expect in this video. The dragon's boon certainly looks tempting, and if it pans out, it could reshape how we build altogether. And well, that's pretty much all I have to say on the Wyrmprint changes that came to Dragalia Lost in version 2.0. I hope this guide video has helped explain some of the changes to you, or inspired ideas as you set off on your own Dragalia adventure. Thank you so much for watching, take care, and I'll see you next time.